Venezuela has suffered another power outage in several regions across the country. The Minister of Communication, Jorge Rodriguez, said it was an attack on the grid similar to the one 2 weeks ago. But this time, he said, measures which had been taken since allowed the electricity system to be restored within a few hours. Rodriguez also presented new evidence to show links between the financial mafias which supported Juan Guaidó.
Todos los mecanismos implementados.
All the mechanisms introduced by President Nicolás Maduro following the brutal attack perpetrated by criminal elements of the far right on Thursday, the 7th of March, have worked perfectly. This includes the backup mechanisms, the prior maintenance, and the communications between the different substations. And this meant that in record time, we were able to restore power almost completely throughout the country.
A Russian Air Force plane has returned from Venezuela. 2 Russian Air Force planes landed in Venezuela on Saturday, carrying a Russian defense official and nearly 100 troops. This comes as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that he believed the U.S. tried to organize a coup in Venezuela. Meanwhile, Pompeo has called on Russia to cease support for President Maduro. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza responded on Twitter saying, quote, "What cynicism that a country like the U.S., with more than 800 military bases throughout the world, much of them in Latin America, and a growing military budget in more than 700 billion, intends to interfere with military technical cooperation programs between Russia and Venezuela." Ariaza goes on to say, quote, "Pompeo well knows that the only tensions in Venezuela are those that his government has created through threats of the use of force, the criminal economic blockade, and the direct leadership that Washington has assumed in the failed attempt at the coup d'etat." Meanwhile, a Chavismo mega march was held today in the Venezuelan state of Barinas. Crowds of people gathered at the anti-imperialist March for Peace and Against Terrorism. The demonstration was led by Governor Chavez and President of the National Constituent Assembly, Diosdado Cabello. Here's a bit of what he had to say.
It's so good to be here in Barinas on this day. We had scheduled the activity here 3 days ago, but we couldn't do it before because of the sabotage, the electrical coup, and the terrorist acts on the electrical system. Today, there was a new attack on the grid by terrorists and the opposition cells that are driven by US imperialism. They have been threatening the Venezuelan people for a long time, and now it's understandable why they have been predicting hard days for our people. I'm going to tell you something, imperialists. Each time you attack the Venezuelan people, those opposition members who no longer support the opposition leaders get nervous, but not the Chavista people. They are strengthened with every single attack and threat that comes from imperialism.
Results from Sunday's local election in Ecuador have been delayed. Our correspondent in Quito, Denise Herrera, has more.
Good afternoon. During a press conference, the president of the National Electoral Council, Diana Tamain, received the first report made by international observers. In this case was the Inter-American Union of Electoral Organizations, UNIORE, who made the first report during the local elections in Ecuador. According to this mission, they didn't see any irregularity during this process. So the president of the National Electoral Council thankful this participation and also said that they are very happy with the results. But until now, we didn't know any final results about the new authorities in Ecuador. So we will see if in these coming hours the authorities of the council set any results.
A judge in Brazil has ordered the release of former President Michel Temer. Temer was arrested in Sao Paulo last Thursday, accused of leading a criminal organization that allegedly received or arranged almost $500 million in bribes. The federal judge was due to hear a habeas corpus request on Wednesday, but brought forward his decision. But it's unclear if Temer will indeed be released. Our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Brian Muir, gives us more.
In an example of a blatant legal double standard, former Brazilian President Michel Temer has just been released from jail after spending only a few days behind bars. Michel Temer was accused of leading an organized crime group that stole over $150 million from the Brazilian federal government over the last several years. Meanwhile, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is behind bars for nearly a year now for alleged illegal reforms in the value of $200,000, which took place in a beachside apartment, which the prosecutors could not prove he ever owned or even set foot in, that happened after he left office. Now, a lot of people are saying that the reason Temer was arrested in the first place was because of an argument inside the Brazilian right between Congressional President Rodrigo Maia and Lula's former inquisitor, Sergio Moro, who is now far-right President Jair Bolsonaro's justice minister. But the fact that Temer's out after such a short time shows that Rodrigo Maia might be winning this battle.
That was Brian Muir in Sao Paulo. Israel and Palestine have agreed to a ceasefire brokered by Egypt. The Israeli military had launched a series of airstrikes in the north of the Gaza Strip. They said this was in response to a Palestinian rocket that hit a house north of Tel Aviv. The Gaza Health Ministry says that 5 Palestinians were wounded. This video reportedly shows an airstrike on the offices of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. It's not clear who, if anyone, was in the building at the time of the strike. As the airstrikes began, the Israeli military sent 2 infantry divisions and closed off border crossings leading out of the Gaza Strip. It was preparing to call up thousands of reservists, raising fears of a full-scale offensive against the Palestinian territory. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he was cutting short a trip to Washington to oversee the operation in Gaza. At a brief meeting at the White House, President Donald Trump signed a decree saying the U.S. fully recognizes Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Turkey's Foreign Affairs Minister has warned that President Donald Trump's recognition of Israel's claim on the occupied Golan Heights is a threat to regional peace. He said the decision goes against international law and will destabilize the entire region. Israel seized Golan Heights during the 1967 war and formally annexed it in 1981, an action that was unanimously rejected by the United Nations Security Council. The Southern African Development Community is holding a 2-day summit to discuss the Western Sahara conflict. Morocco has also called for a meeting on the issue. Our correspondent in Pretoria, Matuba, explains.
The South African Development Community is gathering here in South Africa's capital, Pretoria, in a meeting, a 2-day meeting that's been called to focus on the pressing issue that is Western Sahara. Ironically, this event is taking place on the same day that Morocco also called a meeting on the same issue. Morocco has been feeling the pressure to give up its so-called illegal occupation of Western Sahara. Now, Southern African nations have decided to gather and focus on this matter, but Morocco has also invited other nations in what's been seen as a deflection of a very pressing matter to resolve the Western Sahara issue. And as you may know, that Morocco has fallen out with many countries on this very same issues, with South Africa just restoring its diplomatic ties in 2017 after a long spat over the liberation of Western Sahara from Morocco's illegal occupation. And now other countries like Mali, we hear, which are not part of the Southern African Development Community, have been invited to this event in Morocco. And we also know that a Southern African nation, Malawi, which has just suffered massive damage because of the Idai cyclone, has also been invited to Morocco to attend that. And we also know that a Southern African nation, Malawi, which has just suffered massive damage because of the Idai cyclone, has also been invited to Morocco to attend that. And it seems Malawi will choose Morocco over its neighboring states in the SADC region to go and attend that meeting. And that's seen because of the pressure the financial pressure that Malawi faces, and now it's a tit-for-tat kind of politics that Malawi will go to the Morocco meeting instead, so that it can get the financial assistance it needs to address its own domestic issues. But it remains to be seen what will come out of this two-day meeting here in Pretoria, because the AU has also put a lot of pressure on resolving the Western Sahara issue, and the people of Western Sahara themselves have been calling for independence from Morocco for a while, also calling for the release of dissidents that are arrested in Morocco, because Morocco has been clamping down on any different voice that speaks of independence. But here in Pretoria, it's a wait-and-see situation to see what the heads of states in the Southern African Development Community have come to, the kind of conclusion they have come to on this very sensitive matter on the African continent. It's back to you, studio.
We'll take a short break now. Stay with us. Welcome back. Guyana's opposition, the People's Progressive Party, says it intends to stay away from the parliament until the Caribbean Court of Justice rules on the no-confidence motion against the government. This comes after the appeals court overturned the decision on Saturday, saying the no-confidence motion passed in December was invalid. Opposition leader Bharat Jagdeo says he does not understand the appeals court's decision, which said the motion needed 34 votes and not 33. He intends to challenge the decision.
Mr. Rutherford.
Yes.
The Trinidad and Tobago government has reiterated its position of non-interference in Venezuela's affairs. Foreign Minister Dennis Moses gave the assurance after he and other regional diplomats took part in a conference call with the Venezuelan opposition lawmaker Juan Guaido on Saturday. Moses said even though Guaido presented new information, Trinidad maintains its position. This comes after 5 Caribbean leaders met with the U.S. president on Venezuela.
Ongoing difficulty within Venezuela.
And on Saturday, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, spoke to media in Barbados and said that the leader who met with the U.S. president cannot speak for CARICOM regarding its stance on Venezuela, which is non-interference and non-intervention. He also warned of efforts to divide CARICOM.
It emphasized the principles of non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela. That no country must threaten the use of force is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations also, and to international law generally. That CARICOM reaffirmed its commitment to the values of democracy and human rights. And that we believe that we could contribute towards a resolution of the problems in Venezuela by having a position whereby we will have conversations with all contending forces that might end up with an election, a referendum, or any other agreed mechanism under the Constitution.
LIAT pilots have refused salary cuts proposed by the cash-strapped regional airline, which is based in Antigua. Leeward Islands Pilots Association President Carl Burke says there is no guarantee pilots will recoup their investment. The pilots say they have no confidence in the team and fear that they will be asked to sacrifice even more. Earlier this month, Caribbean countries were asked to contribute $5.4 million in emergency funding to keep the airline running. The indigenous community protests in Colombia has entered its 15th day with about 20,000 people gathering in the Cauca Valley. Our correspondent, Tatiana Portela, has the details.
We are here at the municipality of Dawa in the department of Valle del Cauca, where in a few minutes more than 2,000 indigenous people will depart to join a national indigenous march in La Delfina. This is a peaceful protest that has been ongoing in the departments of Cauca and Valle del Cauca for the last 15 days. The mobilization has been heavily repressed by the Colombian military. Local authorities at the Department of Cauca have strongly condemned the military action against this indigenous march, especially in the village of Cadigio, where military troops arrived to interrupt the indigenous protesters gathering there. We also have to mention that at the Department of Putumayo, indigenous, campesino, and Afro-Colombian communities have set up several road blockades to contribute to this big protest. At La Delfina, demonstrators will join a discussion between various indigenous advisors and campesinos to decide what will be the next step to take. They have been demanding a meeting with President Iván Duque and, of course, that their right to continue with this mobilization is guaranteed, that they can continue with their peaceful march in defense of life and their land, and that President Duque complies with government promises regarding land and personal security made over previous years.
That was Tatiana Portela in Colombia. 8 members of an indigenous community were killed in an explosion last week as they prepared to receive campesinos, indigenous, and Afro-descendant people taking part in the protest.
Members of the Indigenous Guard, a group formed by indigenous people of all ages, said goodbye to the victims of an explosion in the Cauca Valley.
When the Minga was taking place, the Indigenous Guard gathered to receive members of indigenous and campesino communities taking part. It's in that moment that they are attacked and killed.
According to Alex Fernandez, human rights counselor for the Indigenous Guard, both this incident and the defense minister's statement regarding it have to be rejected.
At first, when the police and the public prosecutor arrived to the area, they were told to coordinate with the Indigenous Guard to verify the situation and identify the bodies, but they told the media that the situation was mishandled and that information was manipulated from our part. That is when the National Guard stops collaborating with their investigation.
Authorities and members of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace continue to investigate the tragedy. The government has also called on international organizations to help with the investigation.
It was an attack at 10 in the morning. There were strong clashes with armed groups. Then, there were also drones flying around the area, and there was military presence. So what we think is that all the evidences point out to an attack to sabotage the Minga, our protest.
People who joined to continue the protest said that the statement released by the government against the protest is aimed at breaking up the demonstrations.
They do this not to give an answer to the demands of indigenous people and not to respect their rights. The government is not respecting the agreement reached during the last demonstrations.
While people are still grieving over the death of 8 indigenous people, the Guard has said they will keep on protesting to demand peace in their territories and the fulfillment of the agreements reached with the government since 1991.
People in El Salvador have paid tribute to Oscar Romero on the 39th anniversary of his assassination. Saint Romero was murdered during the Civil War at the hands of a death squad. Last year, he was canonized, becoming the first saint from El Salvador.
A mass was held in the Divina Providencia Church, the same place where Monsignor Oscar Romero was murdered in 1980. Almost 4 decades after his brutal killing, his murderers still haven't been sentenced.
We are happy that he is the first person in El Salvador to be canonized, but we are also very worried about the judicial process of the country, because it is at a standstill, it's not making any progress. The case of Monsignor Romero is still open. Judge Rigoberto Chicas is in charge of it. The family of Monsignor Romero has the right to know the truth.
The civil war in El Salvador began the same year Oscar Romero was murdered. Romero always denounced the powerful class and the abuses by army, forced disappearances, and human rights violations. He was known as the voice of the voiceless.
Through his faith and his great commitment to the people, he knew very well the importance of the church and a true priest. He was always with the people in their struggles and sufferings.
Worshippers took part in the pilgrimage to his tomb. Former combatants also pay tribute to him. They remember Monsignor Romero as their spiritual guide.
Me and a group of combatants were very close to him during the armed conflict. He was killed, but we never stopped worshipping him. He hasn't died. He is still alive for us, alive in the social causes he fought for, against social injustices, and for those who are forgotten by the people in power.
The legacy of Monsignor Oscar Romero continues to strengthen the social struggles of people even 39 years after his murder.
We'll take a short break now. Stay with us. Welcome back. With the hashtag #FreeOurGirls, people are sharing scribbled images of President Pierre Nkurunziza to depict opposition to the arrest of 3 Burundi schoolgirls. The girls, all under age 18, are awaiting trial in a juvenile section of a prison for scribbling on an image of the president printed in their textbooks. They can be prosecuted for contempt of the head of state, facing up to 5 years in jail. Malian citizens in Bamako have spoken out in reaction to the massacre of Fulani people that occurred over the weekend. At least 136 men, women, and children were killed in the attack, which survivors said was carried out by ethnic Dogon hunters. The vice president of the Jina Dogon Association condemned the massacre. Ebola cases in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo have exceeded 1,000, making the current outbreak the second largest ever recorded. According to officials, more than 629 people have died since last August, and 58 new cases have been reported this week. The majority of cases have been recorded in the towns of Katwa and Benai. In the UK, lawmakers have voted to wrest control of Brexit from Prime Minister Theresa May. This comes after May conceded that she still has not secured the votes to get her Brexit deal passed. Last week, EU leaders agreed to postpone Brexit to avoid a no-deal divorce on March 29th, but they warned that unless May can persuade MPs to support her twice-rejected deal, Britain must come up with a new plan by April 12th. Lawmakers are now expected to vote on a range of Brexit options on Wednesday.
The government's approach to Brexit has now become a national embarrassment. Last week's summit represented another negotiating failure for the Prime Minister. Her proposals were rejected and new terms were imposed on her. We now have an extension until mid-April or May the 22nd, and despite the clearly expressed will of this House, we will still face the prospect of a disastrous no-deal Brexit.
A study by the Women's Refugee Commission says that refugees and migrants trying to reach Italy through Libya are falling victim to widespread sexual violence. Speaking at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Project Director Sarah Chenoweth says cases including people being forced to rape corpses, castration, and forced incest, with many cases of people being killed for refusing to do so.
Exploitation, abuse, sometimes slavery. Along the way, they encounter, and this is prior to Libya, they encounter sexual violence at checkpoints, at border crossings, by being stopped by militias, armed groups, in prison. And although this culminates in Libya, which we'll talk more about in a moment, it's really important to underscore that this is happening throughout their journey. People kept telling us, it's not only Libya, it's not only Libya. And one aid worker said, Libya is just icing on the cake. But this is happening throughout the migration route.
For a period lasting over 400 years, more than 15 million men, women, and children were the victims of the tragic transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. On March 25th, we honor and remember those who suffered and died at the hands of the brutal slavery system, as we observe the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. The day not only aims to raise awareness about the dangers of racism and prejudice, it's also a disturbing reminder that slavery continues to exist today. Globally, there are an estimated 46 million enslaved people, a number greater than any other time in history, according to the Global Slavery Index. The refugee crisis is also fueling the market for child slavery. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellusenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Our English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.